Okay, so today we're going to talk about the tractor and engine pre-check. So this is really some of the stuff we're going to go over before we even start the engine on any of these machines. So some of the critical systems and different things we're going to check. There's kind of two separate categories: before we start the tractor and after. Before we start the tractor up, there's a bunch of different things we're going to check. We're going to go over all these in a lot more detail of why it's important and how we're going to check them. But some of the main things are the engine oil, transmission hydraulic fluid, the air cleaner, engine coolant, and the fuel system. And we're going to check for some kind of other obvious things, just leaks or loose fasteners, the cracks or slices or the tire condition, and then the presence of some of the safety equipment on these different machines. After startup, we'll look for unusual noises or vibrations, some different functionality, general functionalities of the different throttle levers, the shifters and linkages, some of the gauges, and the clutch and brakes. A lot of these things are kind of hard to know if you have an issue if you're not that familiar with the machine. So knowing that the brakes are functioning properly might not be the easiest thing to know if you've never been on it. So anyway, we'll talk about just some of the most basic things to check, but we'll go over that as we go. But a lot of these things are kind of difficult to know if you're not familiar with the machine. All right, so first thing we are going to check is the engine oil. So before we get into how to check the engine oil, I want to talk a little bit about why it's so important. So some of the important jobs that we have, number one really is lubricating all the parts moving inside of the engine. So we talked about the piston moving up and down in the sleeve or in the block. We have the crankshaft down here and connecting rods. So those are some of the most basic parts, but beyond those, there are a ton of moving parts within this engine. Hundreds, if not thousands, of parts moving inside here. So we have to make sure that all those things are lubricated and working properly. An engine without oil may run for a minute or two and then be completely ruined, like no saving it. If an engine runs out of oil and continues to run for, like I said, just a minute or two, all those things that need to have oil in them are now just metal on metal rubbing, and then that generates a lot of heat, and then all those things can tend to kind of fuse together and seize up, and your engine will not last. Sometimes the engine oil is used to actuate different things like injectors or lifters. Uh, an injector is injecting fuel into the engine. So for a diesel engine, this is a little diesel engine right here. Our injectors are what I'm talking about is what is injecting diesel into the engine. So sometimes that's actually kind of inherent safety feature. If your engine runs low on oil, the injectors can't actuate, it can't spray diesel fuel into the engine, so the engine just shuts off. So some diesel engines are like that, but not all. That's not necessarily that common. That's just something out there. But anyway, and then we'll talk about what lifters are when we talk about the valve train. But anyway, engine oil is very critical for really, these are kind of the most important jobs. And then third is just kind of a byproduct. It prevents rust on the internal engine components. So the inside of the engine is just oil coated on everything. So when you have oil kind of covering all those metal surfaces, uh, with the oil on it, rust won't take place when we have that oil kind of coating on everything. So that's just kind of another important thing that's going on inside the engine. No rust buildup, but really the lubrication of all these moving parts is kind of the most critical job of the engine oil. So before we go to the next slide, so one important thing, so as the engine oil is pumped through this system, it's lubricating parts up on the top, down here on the bottom, all throughout this thing, there are moving parts. So it is pumped throughout the entire engine. So after it gets pumped through a bearing or something, wherever it is allowed to drain back through different drain passages into the bottom, and it all collects back down here in the oil pan, which is at the bottom of the engine, right? So it gets pumped up through the engine, and then gravity brings it back down, and it collects back down here, and the oil pump sucks up oil from the oil pan and then pumps it back through the system. So it's kind of just cycling through the engine continuously. But anyway, it all collects down here at the bottom. So when we go to check the engine oil, a lot of times, at least on most tractors, we're looking down here around the bottom of the engine for something to check the engine oil. All right. So how to check the engine oil. So number one, we're going to park the tractor on flat ground. We don't want it tipped forward or backward or left or right, because that can tend to kind of skew our results when we check the oil. We want it flat, so all the oil is down at the bottom where it's supposed to be. Another important thing with most of these different things that we're going to check is that we want to make sure that as we pull the dipstick out or we open up a lot of times, like I think this right here is how you pour oil into the engine. So it's got this big old cap. So with either one of these, we want to make sure that when we pull the dipstick out or take this cap off, that dirt doesn't fall down into the engine. So this picture is a super clean tractor. It's probably brand new, so there's no real dirt or even dust on this thing. But that's not really the case. And a lot of times these are super dirty or muddy. There's dirt caked on and dust all over. So when you pull the dipstick out, you can tend to have dirt fall in there, which we don't want to happen. So we're going to make sure that it's clean around the dipstick or something that we're pulling out. Next step is we're going to pull the dipstick out and we're going to wipe it off. A lot of times, if the engine was just running or if it was recently running, you go to check the oil, and oil has been sloshing around inside the engine, and the whole dipstick can kind of be covered in oil. So we clean it off, then we'll put for number 4, we'll put the dipstick back in and pull it out, and then that should give us a relatively clean reading on the bottom of the dipstick. So once we've done that, we can look at the dipstick and see where the oil is in regards to, a lot of times we'll have an add and a full mark on the dipstick. So these are kind of different scenarios, right? So this portion is really like probably this bottom, 2 or 3 inches of this dipstick here. So you'll see different hash marks or different, just maybe they're just lines or dots or something like that on this that indicate add and full. So usually between, right, we have add down at the bottom, that's kind of a little low, and then full up here at the top. Usually between add and full is usually like a quart or 2 between these. So, if we pulled the dipstick out and we saw that oil was right here, and then we wanted to bring it up to full, this might be 1 to 2 quarts. And sometimes even on the dipstick, it'll tell you how many that is. If you pull the dipstick out and you saw 0 oil on it, I would not start that engine. I would probably add some oil to it to get it back up somewhere in this range. Doesn't have to be completely full. Somewhere in the middle is totally fine. Even with just a little bit of oil on the dipstick, it's not necessarily going to hurt itself when you start it up, but you probably want it somewhere up here in the middle of this add to full range. Similarly, you don't necessarily want it down here. You really don't want it overfull either. Overfull can tend to do things that aren't necessarily what you want. If it's too full, it can tend to, the oil won't drain properly through the engine back down to the bottom, and you can have oil kind of starting to come out of the different breathers on the engine and things like that. You don't want an overfull engine. It also can, that's all the oil is residing in the oil pan down here. So if it's too full, the crankshaft spinning around right here, if it gets upwards in the way of the crankshaft, you can actually tend to lose a little bit of power because the crankshaft is now spinning, that oil is like in the way of it rotating around. So anyway, too full is also not necessarily a good thing either. Okay. Oh, and then one last thing. A lot of times on tractors, at least, not all the time, but most of the time when we're looking for the dipstick on the engine, right, again, the oil pan is down at the bottom, so we're kind of looking towards the bottom of the engine for the dipstick. And a lot of times this would be on the well, I guess you drive in the middle of a tractor, but the driver's side, if you're thinking about a car. So if you're sitting in the seat looking forward, it'd be on the left-hand side, down on the bottom of the engine. Cars and trucks and different things, you pop the hood, so you're kind of looking at the top of the engine. Most of the time, the dipsticks, it can be all over the place. So, but on a tractor, a lot of times we're looking at the driver's side down near the bottom. All right. So the next big thing in our pre-check is the transmission and hydraulic fluid. So in your car, it's relatively common to check your transmission fluid from time to time. But in your car, your transmission and your rear end and some of these different things are all separate. In a tractor, the transmission is the oil that's in the transmission is doing a lot greater jobs, or a lot different jobs than in your car. It's not just the transmission fluid; it's doing a bunch of different things. So, and that kind of comes from, if you look at like this kind of line drawing of a tractor, we have our engine up here, we have our transmission and our rear differential, and then our axles that come out to our rear tires here. Well, the transmission and the differential are basically, you know, the cases are bolted together and they share the same oil. So in a car, your transmission is not necessarily that close. You know, we're thinking about more of like a front engine, rear wheel drive car. Your transmission's not that close to your rear differential, so they're separate from each other. The oil in each are different. But in a tractor, that's not necessarily the case. They are the same thing. So the transmission fluid is doing a lot of different jobs, whereas in your car, your transmission fluid is just your transmission fluid. But anyway, so that's just a little bit of a difference. So similar to our engine oil, kind of the first main job is to lubricate all of the moving parts within the transmission and the rear axle. So again, there could be hundreds, if not thousands, of different moving parts that need to be oiled so that they last. All the different gears that are meshing together for the transmission, or the different bearings and different things, need to be oiled. Sometimes the brakes are even in an oil bath inside there as well. Most of the time, your brakes on a car, you know, out on the outside, they wouldn't be submerged in oil. But sometimes in a tractor, they call them a wet brake. They're in an oil bath, and it's all the same fluid. And again, another thing, right, like I said, all the different jobs, it can be the fluid source for a bunch of different other hydraulic components. So we'll get familiar with the tractors with loaders. We'll talk about the 3-point lift later on, some of the auxiliary hydraulics, and then even sometimes power steering and brakes can be incorporated into basically the transmission back here. So all the oil in here is not only just sloshing around lubricating these gears, but it is, you know, pumped out of the system and used to run the loader on the front. The hydraulic oil in the transmission also is what is responsible for lifting and lowering the 3-point and all these different things. So the transmission fluid in a tractor is doing a lot of different jobs and is pretty critical. So we're going to check the transmission fluid as well. Okay, so similar procedure as the in that we need to park the tractor on flat ground. If it's not flat, the oil can tend to be at one side of the case or the other, and it's not going to give us an accurate reading. So we make sure the tractor's parked on flat ground. And then the next step, right, figure out how to check the oil. So it's not necessarily like with tractors with the engine oil up on the engine. It's like pretty much the only way to check the engine oil is with a dipstick. I've never seen an engine where there was a different way to check the fluid level in the engine. It's pretty much always a dipstick. The transmission, however, there's a bunch of different ways to check the oil. And it's different manufacturer to manufacturer across the board. It can be all over the place. So there's a couple different ways. This right here is showing what's called a sight glass. So if you notice, this is the PTO shaft. So this is on some of the John Deeres that we'll look at in lab, or one of the John Deeres that we look at in lab has this on the very back. So right next to the PTO shaft, there's these two little glass windows in the in the transmission, in the case right here. So just by coming back here and observing this, you can see that the this little window right here has a little cast in where it says add, and then this one on the top says full. So we see oil in the full window, so there you go, it's full. If we were to see this kind of bubble and this oil level down here in the add window, we'd know we'd need to add a little bit of fluid to it. So that's one way to do this. Like nowadays, it's pretty common to see these sight glasses on the transmissions, but it wasn't always that common. If you kind of think about this, we have to, we have this big metal case, and then now we have to drill this hole and put this sight glass and seal this thing in here so that the oil doesn't leak out of here. It's kind of a complicated thing. It's very convenient for the operator just to come back here and look at this and say, okay, here you go, this is where the oil is. But from a manufacturer's standpoint, it's kind of a complicated thing to make that. So not necessarily that common traditionally. It's just, really it's like another place for oil to leak from this thing. So traditionally it's not that common to have this. But anyway, nowadays you can see that they're on a lot of different machines. Similar to the engine oil, we can have dipsticks on these. So somewhere on the transmission that's not necessarily in one specific place or another, but there will be a dipstick that works similar to the engine. You pull it out, wipe it off, insert and pull it out again, and then look at where the oil is. And if you think about that, a dipstick, come back and just look at this. It's a lot easier to make this thing seal, right? We're not relying on a hole in the engine down here with a window in it. We, you have this kind of tube coming out that's pretty easy to seal here, and then you just insert this out. There's not really a chance for this to leak very, very much. But with these sight glasses, there is kind of a chance for them to leak. So anyway, a dipstick's a little bit easier from a manufacturer's standpoint, I would say. And then even a little bit cruder than that is sometimes it is just simply a fill hole location. So where you put the oil into the transmission, sometimes there's just a plug on the side of the transmission, like a big plug that you pull out, and that's where you put the oil in. And they put that plug so that when you have it out, you just fill it up until the engine oil starts to dribble out, and then, all right, you're full. So that's, I guess, kind of 2 and 3. If it has a dipstick or a sight glass, kind of follow, I guess if it is a dipstick, you follow the procedure of checking the engine oil. If only the fill hole is present, you basically just fill the transmission until oil starts to kind of dribble out of that hole, and then you're done. The fill hole is not like on the top of it. It's located on the side somewhere. So you'd only ever fill these things up like maybe halfway, probably not even that far. So anyway, that's kind of how we check the transmission and hydraulic fluid in these different machines. And this one, like I said, can be different. There's no kind of standard location to look or anything like that. It's kind of all over the board for where you check it and how you check it and that sort of thing. Okay, so the next critical system we're going to check is the air cleaner. So really the main job of the air cleaner system is to prevent dust and dirt from entering the engine. So I mean, really that's it. We're not, not doing really anything else, just keeping the dirt and debris out of the engine. If we think about this from kind of a different standpoint, so your car, driving it around on the streets, imagine how dusty is that setting, how dirty is the setting for your car driving around. Most of the time it's not that dirty. If you're driving it through, down a dirt road or in a field or something like that, okay, yeah, it's a little bit dirtier. But like just on, a paved road driving through town, it's really not that dirty of a setting. All right, now we think about kind of a tractor, right? So, it spends its entire life in a field in these kind of dirty, dusty conditions. So the air cleaner on tractors are generally far more robust and better air cleaners than on a car, just because of the system the setting that they're in, right? They're always in dirty conditions. Your car, most of the time, the air is relatively clean. We kind of think about the other end of the spectrum. I've I have a small boat that I take out on the lake every now and again, and it does not have an air cleaner on it. Um, and that's how it came from the factory. Most of the time on boats, you look into them and they don't have air cleaners in them. And why is that, right? I mean, when you're out on the lake or out on the water, how dirty is the air? It's really not at all, right? There's not much dust and dirt out on the lake. So small boat engines usually don't have air cleaners on them, or maybe just a screen or a very crude, very simple air cleaner. So that's kind of the other end of the spectrum. Boats, really not much air cleaners at all. Cars are kind of in the middle, and then tractors generally have a much more complicated air cleaner system because they're always in dirty, dusty conditions. All right, so most of the time on modern tractors, they're kind of done in 3 stages, but I've seen other tractors that are, you know, you kind of, sometimes it's all over the place, but usually at least one air filter. A lot of times these modern machines have these kind of 3 stages. So the first one is a pre-cleaner. So that's this thing right here. Air, it comes up through the bottom of this, and it has these fins in here, which kind of throws the air in this kind of cyclone effect. So all the heavy stuff gets kind of thrown out and then collects around here on the outside, and then clean air goes down through the middle. So air kind of comes up around through these little fins, comes down, circles around, and then down, kind of follows that little metal rod down through the middle into the engine. So this is really like for large objects and particles. So like, you know, maybe actual like blades of grass and stuff. Like when I clean out the pre-filter on our tractors, I do a lot of work in hay fields and stuff like that every summer. I actually get, you know, like grass and hay that kind of comes out of these. So not necessarily like big pieces of grass, but smaller pieces and stuff like that. And then some, you know, relatively the kind of bigger dust particles get stuck in here. So every time at the beginning of the season, usually I take this thing off and really clean out this clear glass bowl, and then go from there, because that will kind of fill up with dirt. So that's the first one. That's really just to get the big stuff. Then usually this feeds into filter element housing that looks similar to this. And most of the time within these, we have 1 or 2 different filters. So those are kind of like paper filters, similar to what you have in your car or something like that. But a lot of times you have a primary filter and then a secondary filter. So, you know, we kind of think about it from, you know, the first thing gets out the biggest particles, primary filter gets out the medium particles, and then the secondary filter gets out the finest particles. So that's kind of what's going on with these things right here. So most older tractors maybe only had just 1 filter, but more modern machines, this kind of 3-stage approach is very common on all kind of tractor engines. Okay, so to actually check the system, we're going to empty the pre-cleaner, right? So we're going to open this thing up and clean that thing out. And then we're going to dust off the filter housing. So similar to when we were talking about engine oil, we want to make sure, you know, a lot of times these are super dusty, dirty things. So when we open up this housing, we don't want, you know, and pull the filters out to clean up, we don't want all the dust on the outside of this thing getting into the engine, right? That's the whole thing that this thing's trying to prevent, is dirt from getting in the engine. So we kind of clean this thing off to make sure that by opening it up, we're not letting in dirt into the engine. So dust off the housing, then we'll pull out the filters and observe the elements. So this is a pretty common, this is, I think, like the primary filter. I mean, these are 2 different things, but you know, a new one, they look pretty clean. An older one, you can kind of see on the outside of this, it's pretty like dark and tan and, well, the color of dirt. And then on the inside, it's a little bit cleaner. Right? If I pulled this filter out, I would not put it back in. I would totally replace that thing. So, you know, you don't want to see that much dirt built up on this thing. So, you know, we'll observe the condition of the filters, and a lot of times the manufacturer recommends that you replace it so many hours. So you know, keep track of that. Just replace the filters. They're not that expensive, so you know, no sense putting a dirty filter back in it. And then another important thing is to inspect the air intake ducting for cracks or leaks or loose connections and stuff like that. So not just looking at the air filters, but there's other places where dirt can get into the system and ruin an engine. Most of the time, it's not necessarily that the air filters failed; it's that the air intake, maybe the housing broke and is letting dirt in on the other side of the filter, just straight into the engine. So like I said, the filters, even a dirty clogged filter isn't really going to fail and let dirt into the system. It's that when the housing breaks, you can let dirt in and ruin an engine pretty quick if that happens. So checking the filters, but also a very important thing is to inspect the ducting for the intake air, to make sure that dirt's not getting in another place. All right. So one more big critical thing, a couple more things to go after this. So we have the engine coolant. So same thing within different cars. Any liquid cooled engine. A lot of motorcycles have air cooled engine. Even some smaller cars, not necessarily nowadays, but VW Bugs and stuff. The older VWs used to have air cooled engines, and there are some industrial engines out there that are air cooled, but by and large, most all engines are liquid cooled. So the coolant, or a lot of times you hear it called water, you can run an engine with just water in the coolant. That's pretty common, but a lot of times you put other things in it. So anyway, you put additives in it, or ethylene glycol is what it's called, engine coolant. That it's usually half water, half ethylene glycol. That's what gives it that kind of green look. If you've ever checked your coolant, there are some different things out there, but a lot of times, anyway, the liquid that is cooling your engine. So on the front of an engine, usually there's what's called a water pump. So when you see the fan spinning around on the front of the engine, usually right behind it is the water pump. And the water pump is circulating fluid through the engine, around all the pistons and sleeves, up through the heads, back up through the top, and then down through a radiator. So a radiator on the front of your car or on a tractor is what's called a heat exchanger. So it's taking hot water that just came out of the engine and pushing it down through the radiator. As the air blows through the radiator, right, a heat exchanger, the heat from that water is transferred into the air. The air is then blown off, and then the water coming out of the bottom of the radiator is much cooler and then cycled back through the engine. So the water picks up heat in the engine, comes back through the radiator to cool down, and then is continually circulated through the engine. So the water pump is just always circulating water through the engine, from the engine through the radiator, and then back through. So if anybody's ever overheated a car or something like that, so something goes wrong with this system, and it can get too hot very quickly. Depending on the engine, some smaller engines might take a lot longer to heat up and overheat, but different things can happen very quickly. So anyway, that's kind of what's going on, and it is circulating this coolant through the engine and then through the radiator. So to check this, the radiator is on a tractor or car is always up on the front of the engine. We're drawing air through the front of the engine. It goes through the radiator, and then it goes over the engine and out and kind of blowing up. So there's always the fan is circulating air through the radiator, across the engine, and out. So that's we're always looking at the front of the engine. And with your car, it gets the benefit of it moving relatively quickly down the road, and that moving air is blowing across the radiator on the front as well. So we want to inspect and make sure that there is enough coolant in the engine. So we're going to inspect, there's a couple different procedures. So number one, if we have a coolant reservoir, we're just simply going to look at the reservoir and see how much fluid is in it. A lot of times these are kind of a clear reservoir that you can see through, and right here we look at this, and there's a minimum and a maximum line, and most of the time this is, you know, you're supposed to check this when the engine is cold. So when water heats up, it expands. So in the engine, none of this has, like, there's nowhere for the water to expand. It will grow, but where's it going to go? It has to be let out of the system. This is all kind of, think of this as like a fixed volume. There's nowhere for the water to go if it expands. So the water has to go out somewhere. So in this system, when we have a reservoir, the water expands. It kind of pushes it out into this little reservoir, and then as the water cools down, it will pull that oil, or that not the oil, it will pull the coolant back into the radiator. So this time on these sort of things, usually you'll see a minimum and maximum line. And that's usually you're supposed to check when the engine is cold, or sometimes they have like a cold and a hot line on them. They're all a little bit different. So sometimes the minimum max is cold and hot. Sometimes they're actually labeled cold and hot. But in any case, the radiator at all times should be completely full in this system, and that sort of thing. So if there is no reservoir like this that you can see, the only way to check the coolant level is to remove the radiator cap and inspect it. So we'll do that on a handful of the different tractors. The important thing is that you never do this, or really you never check the coolant on an engine that is hot. They have to be cooled down to inspect this. The reason being is, when this heats up, when the water expands, the cap on the radiator isn't just letting water out freely. It's pressurized, basically. So all this is pressurized. So when the engine's hot, it's pressurized. That is, when it's cold, it's not. So if you pulled this cap off when the engine was hot, all that pressurized coolant comes spraying out of there and will cover you with 200-degree water. So it's very easy to burn yourself. I've seen people get burnt. I've burnt myself on radiator water before. So you never do this on a hot engine. So anyway, as long as it's cool, when you pull the radiator cap off with an engine with no reservoir, you should see the coolant maybe an inch or two below the radiator cap surface. So this engine right here, we have our radiator. The cap is right here on the top. I think that's what that is right there. So you pull the cap off, you look down in there, and it should be, maybe an inch or two down, and that's normal, right? So when this tractor heats up, that water expands, and there's just kind of a volume of air in here, and it kind of spits the air out, and then it doesn't spit coolant out, but that's what's happening there. So you have to have room for the coolant to expand somewhere. So sometimes we catch that in overflow reservoirs, sometimes we don't. All right, one more important system is the fuel system. So there's a couple different filters and different things on a lot of these tractors, and we'll talk about what they're doing. So, you might just think of the fuel filter as separating out dirt and debris out of the system, but it's also a lot of times separating water out of the fuel system. So when a machine sits for a long time with a low fuel level in the tank, water condensation can tend to build up in the tank, and then settle down, and it will settle into the bottom of the tank. Water is heavier than diesel or gasoline, so water always settles to the bottom, which is generally right where the fuel pickup is, right where it sucks fuel out of the tank. So that's kind of an inherent issue with these types of systems. The water is the heavier thing, so it comes down. So it's basically the first thing that gets sucked out of the tank is the water that's in the bottom. And then also, like I said, we need to filter out the dirt and debris. Even like this is especially important on a diesel tractor, is even the tiny bits of dirt can clog the fuel systems. So, diesel injection systems are very delicate. Gasoline engines are not, they can handle a little bit dirtier fuel, but either way, you don't want dirty fuel getting into the engine. Kind of the same as you don't want dirty air getting in there as well. It can tend to clog up and wear out parts prematurely. So, fuel filter, separate out the dirt and separate out the water. So this is a John Deere fuel filter. Um, so a lot of times when we check the fuel system, it's really a lot of times they put these glass bowls, or this is really plastic, but this bowl on the bottom, and it's clear for a reason. You could, like I said before, right? Water always settles to the bottom, so they have these clear glass bowls so that you can look in there and see if water is kind of building up in the bottom of this filter. So it's separating the water out. Water's heavier, so it comes all the way down through the filter, and then it's taking the diesel fuel off of the top. So it never pulls fuel off the bottom of this, so you can see the water will tend to build up. So this little picture right here is what you would see if you had water in the system. So diesel that you put in tractors is usually dyed red. Diesel fuel is not always red. It's kind of a green, or a kind of a clear with maybe a green or yellowish tinge to it. Normally, that's what you put in your car. But they take diesel and they dye it red to put in tractors so that you're not paying different road taxes. A lot of what you're paying for at the fuel pump when you fill up your car is different road taxes and such. So they dye diesel red to go in tractors, and it's like 50 cents cheaper than diesel that goes on the road for the different road taxes. But anyway, this is kind of what you would see down here if there was water in it. And a lot of times they have these little spigots on the bottom that you just open this up and it will drain out your fuel filter. So all the water drains out first. Then once the diesel starts flowing out of it, you just stop that back up, and then you drain the water out and you're kind of good to go. So that's a pretty easy thing. So check the water separator and drain it off. And then most of the time you just replace the fuel filters at the recommended interval. So, you look in the manual, it says replace your fuel filters maybe every 500 hours on the machine or something like that, and you replace those. So one other thing that might seem pretty simple is make sure that we have a sufficient amount of fuel. Especially with a diesel engine, running out of diesel can tend to hurt the engine. Or at least you have to work on it to get it back running again. And we'll talk about why that is later, but it's not as simple as just some of the more modern machines. It is relatively so. You just pour fuel back in it and it fires back up. But on older diesel engines, you have to get your tools out and wrench on it a little bit before it will run again. So that's kind of an important thing, not to run out of diesel. I've had that happen before on different tractors, because of course none of the fuel gauges work on the tractors we have that I run every summer, and running out of diesel sucks because it ends up spending a couple hours working on it, trying to get it to back started again, and it's just time consuming. Also, like I said earlier, sitting for a long time with low fuel, you can get condensation that will build up in the tank, and you get water in it, which is also not a good thing. So most of the time, you try to leave things mostly full of fuel so that that condensation thing doesn't happen as much. All right. So those are kind of the main fluid systems, and we're going to talk about some of the other pre-checks that we're going to do. So looking over the tire condition, some important things to look for: tread depth. Yeah, you replace them when worn, but even a completely bald tractor tire that holds air is good enough for me. So, you're not just going to kind of replace those. Most of the time, you don't wear tires out until they're completely bald. They end up getting cut or popped or something, and you have to replace them for that. Anyway, looking around for different gashes like this in a tire is something I do on a regular basis. Sometimes when you see big gashes like this, the tire might still hold air, but so it might be all right. But when it has a big gash like that, it's slowly getting larger and larger and larger. couple summers ago, I was running one of our tractors and it had a small gash in the tire, and eventually it just got big enough and big enough, and then the tire popped while I was in the middle of a hayfield way out away from our ranch. So it was, something that I could have replaced, in the shop at our ranch relatively. I mean, it's still a lot of work, but relatively easily. But instead, I was out in the middle of a hayfield with this stupid thing. Have to go get all the tools and take it out there to replace the tire, right when I was in the middle of trying to make hay, which is, not when you want to be working on your tractor. So anyway, I've kind of learned my lesson with that. I see a big gash in a tire, and replace it before I'm out doing something kind of critical, right? Cutting hay or whatever that has to happen right then, and instead I'm wrenching on the tractor. But anyway, so looking for gashes and stuff like that is important. All right, just looking around for obvious leaks. If it's dripping oil from something, it might be something to check. It might not be a huge deal, but making sure that it's not, leaking a ton, or at least not leaking more than it normally is, right? So, keep an eye on stuff like that. Looking for loose lug nuts or different fasteners. If you guys look and see the buses driving around, a lot of times you'll see them with these little tags on the lug nuts. So it can be kind of hard to look at a tire and say, oh yeah, that lug nut's loose, right? They all look the same. You can't really tell. But with these little tags on them that you see on like all the buses nowadays, if that thing kind of rotates off, you know that, oh, that one's coming loose. I need to check that. So just by observing this, you see, oh, okay, all these are lined up like they should be. So none of the lug nuts are loose at all. So anyway, that's something that I see on all the buses running around town and stuff like that. Then just some kind of general things. A lot of these, like I was saying, are kind of takes being familiar with the tractor to know what's going on, or to know how they should feel. But we kind of want to pre-check the brakes, make sure that they move freely, they lock together, they're adjusted properly, stuff like that. Can be kind of critical, but most of the time the brakes are, they're not just like go from being fine to, something critical kind of happens if they're like worn out. They're not going to really change much day to day. But anyway, also the clutch, I've had to mess with this a bunch on a couple of our tractors. I've replaced the clutch and had to, readjust all the linkages and stuff like that. But it is something, like again, once you kind of have a feel for it, you know how the clutch should feel in the tractor, especially if you operate it a lot. So making sure that it moves freely, it operates properly, and adjusted just right. A couple years ago, I always go, like I said, go back home to make hay on my brother's place, and I got all the way back there, and I needed to go get the tractor with the mower on it from this field that he was running, and to get the tractor, and then I was basically taking it to go mow like the next day. I jumped in the tractor, stepped on the clutch, and I immediately knew that there was an issue, right? The clutch was all burnt up, and my brother did not tell me that, which was super frustrating. He had just got done with it, and then I called him, and he was like, "Oh yeah, no, it felt kind of funny." I was like, "Yeah, no kidding." All right, I've been like, dang it, if I would have had the parts on order, already had them, I could have just fixed it basically in a day or two, and then been ready to go. But instead, I had to wait on parts and all this sort of stuff, even though he kind of knew it burned out anyway. So there you go, frustrating brothers. But anyway, just knowing, having the feel of it can tell you if it's about to wear out or not. But it really takes kind of knowing the tractor a little bit better. But anyway, all right. One more thing. So last slide for this lecture. This one's kind of long. So before we go to driving around these things, one of the important things is the kind of throttle operation or warm-up procedures. So when you first fire up an engine, it's really important, especially on these industrial type engines, to let it warm up before we run it, before we just go into operating. And it's kind of important with cars and stuff too. But really, in these sort of settings, like I'll be out in the field, you know, my tractor's kind of parked out in the field in the middle of the hay season, and it's just been sitting there uh, waiting, you know, from the night before. And I'm basically go out, fire it up, and I'm already in the field and I'm ready to, you know, operate and start baling again. Well, if I just simply fired it up and took off, the engine's really cold. It hasn't had a chance to warm up, and a lot of engine wear can occur if you do this. It can be pretty hard on an engine to run it hard when it's still cold. So anyway, letting it warm up for, you know, several minutes is important. So what I'll do when I get out to, you know, if my tractor's out already hooked up and ready to go, then I usually start it up and then, you know, get out and, you know, drink some coffee or whatever, go walk around and grease different things um, before I start going again. Let it have a chance to warm up. If I'm like in the barnyard or something, yeah, I'll fire it up and I'm just idling it around, driving it around to, you know, maybe I'm going to hook up an implement. Oh, it takes me long enough to hook up this implement that it gives a chance, tractor a chance to warm up before I'm running it hard. But if I'm, you know, if it's basically parked and ready to, you know, continue baling or something, I'm going to start it and let it warm up for several minutes before I run it. Um, because, you know, again, the majority of the engine wear can occur during warm up and stuff like that. So giving it a chance to heat up and everything to expand and you know, get oil everywhere it needs to be before we run it hard is important. Another thing is letting it cool down. I'll do this as well. Again, kind of thinking about that setting in a hay field. If I'm, you know, baling and I'm just basically parking in the field and then I'm taking off and I'm going to come back in the next morning, it doesn't really get a chance to cool down. If I go from baling to shut down, it doesn't really have a chance to cool off very much. So you kind of want you want to let it idle for a couple minutes. If you're basically done and you just got done from running it super hard and you're ready to shut it off, you should let it cool down for another couple minutes before it goes. It'll give the chance for, you know, if we come back to all the way back to here, you know, if you're running it super hard, the engine's got a lot of heat in it and it's still cycling the coolant through the radiator and stuff. You kind of need to give it a chance for the temperature to equalize throughout the whole thing before you go. Otherwise you'll kind of get hot spots in the engine, you know, because as soon as you shut this thing off, it stops cycling the coolant through it, and you know, the engine can still have a lot of heat in it and it can tend to get really hot inside the engine because you stopped circulating the coolant around. So that's kind of important too, is to let it cool down. So I'll do that as well. Um, you know, if I'm parking it in the field and I just got done, you know, I don't really, you know, if I'm driving it back to the barnyard to park it or whatever, you know, that maybe might take 10 or 15 minutes just to drive it and park it. I got a chance to cool down doing that because I'm just kind of idling around. But if I'm parking it after running it super hard, I usually let it idle for a little bit and then shut it down after, you know, like I said, 5 minutes or so. Also, it can be important with turbocharged engines. Um, Same idea with the coolant cycling around, but it's cycling oil through the turbo, which we'll talk about what turbos are later. But um, turbos are basically forcing air into the engine. They're connected to the exhaust, so they're super hot. And you know, if we just shut it off real quick, the oil inside the turbo can get very hot and you know, can kind of ruin the turbo and stuff like that. But anyway, it's important to let it warm up and also let it cool down in these different settings, um, and that sort of thing. So anyway, there you go. That's your lecture for today, a whole hour and 5 minutes.